So, you built your model, painted it, and applied all the decals. It's looking alright, but it's missing that certain je ne sais quoi, that pièce de résistance, the je ne parle pas français. Everyone on YouTube uses an airbrush, so all the techniques for making it pop aren't physically possible without one. What you need, mon ami, are some oil paints. This is a set I bought on clearance for $3, and for that price I can't really complain. It's got all the colours you'd need and then some. The more expensive ones such as Winsor & Newton or Abteilung would presumably be better quality and yield better results, but are of course a fair bit more expensive. It might be worth buying high quality versions of colours you'd use 100% of the time, such as black, burnt umber and white, and then keep a cheap set for everything else. You'll also need something to thin the paint with. You can use white spirits, which is cheap and gets the job done, but I'd really urge you to get some Artist Odorless Thinner or like Tamiya X20, whatever's cheaper really, because while getting Rama because you're weathering a small plane is really funny, it's also probably not the best for your continued health and well-being. Lastly, some paintbrushes. I just use my spare, more beaten up ones, but if you must go out and buy more things for whatever reason, makeup blending brushes are apparently pretty helpful, and you get the fun experience of being looked at weirdly at the checkout. So, step 0. I'm going to start off by assuming you've at least watched a single other video about scale modelling. All of these techniques will be done over a satin surface after a panel line wash. If you don't know what a panel line wash is, there are about 1 trillion videos explaining that in more detail than I can bring myself to care about. As for the satin surface, you can technically do this over gloss, although I found that satin sort of grabs onto the oil paints better, making for some better blending. Also, just as an aside, when you're using oil paints, put them on an absorbent surface such as paper towel or cardboard before you transfer them onto a palette. This gets most of the oil out and allows them to dry in a more reasonable time frame. Step 1 is a bit of colour modulation. First, you want to get some oil paints that are similar but different shades to your base colours. With this Hurricane, I've lightened up a bit of green and yellow with some white for the green bits, and likewise brown and yellow for the dark earth bits. If you have any prior knowledge about art, knowledge of how the colour wheel works may come in handy, but otherwise you get the general idea. Once you've got your colours, dot them onto the model. Don't put on too much because oil paints are generally pretty strong and you can easily make your perfectly picked out base colours look terrible that way. Next, take a brush and soak it in the thinner. Proceed to dab and stipple the brush on the dots until they're decently blended in, and with any luck, once the thinner's evaporated, you should be left with your base colours looking more varied and less optically uniform. This photo of said Hurricane highlights this effect pretty well. Step 2 is fading. Using a smallish brush, dot on some white oil paint. Ideally you'd want to have a bunch of small dots that are concentrated towards the center of panels so as to create a bit of visual separation between them, although for wicked small bits such as these areas between rivet lines, you can just about get away with 1 or 2 little splotches. Again, you'll want to use a sparing amount of paint with this, but mainly because you don't want to get into the other panels if you can avoid it. Next, with a dry brush, blend the white paint in. Again, this sort of depends on the size of the area you're working with. You can stipple, you can do little circular motions, you can even get thinners involved like the last technique if you really so desire. And finally, step 3, darkening those panel lines. This is pretty similar to step 2, so using a fine brush, apply a very fine bead of dark color oil paints along each panel line. I like using a mixture of black and burnt umber that leans a little more towards the black, although this is ultimately a matter of preference. And, while I have said it twice, it bears repeating. Don't use too much oil paint. It's much easier to gradually build up this effect than it is to reset after you decided you're not happy with the result you've gotten after using the entire world's reserve of burnt umber on a single panel line. Then, with the dry brush, blend in the paint along the panel lines. You can just go along the panel lines to keep some semblance of subtlety, or do small circular motions to really ham it up. After that, you're pretty much done. Seal it up with your choice of varnish and bada bing bada boom, you should hopefully have something that looks a little less boring than it was before.